The next menu that we can take a look at is Simulation Hair Options. So we're just going to break this off so we can take a look at all these options. The first option that we have here is pretty straightforward. It's a toggle switch, and it's going to allow us to enable or disable hair in the scene. So if we go back to the object mode here, untoggle the hair enabled, you'll see that all of the hair disappears. Toggling hair enabled back on brings all the hair back into the scene. And this is going to work for both render and editor visibility. So if we render here, nothing renders, enable hair and render, and you can see that we have lovely hairs floating there in space. The next option that we have is symmetry, and this is a toggle again. So in this case, what it's going to allow us to do is toggle symmetry editing on and off. So we have fairly symmetrical hair here. If we go to Simulation, and then Hair Tools, and choose something like the brush, we can now begin to brush our hair, and you'll see that these are going to be edited in a symmetrical fashion. If we untoggle symmetry, we can go back to editing, and it's only going to change one side. We'll just step back here. We then have an option for soft selection, and if we just select a single hair here, or maybe one over here, you'll see that there is a preview that is added into the scene when soft selection is enabled. So what this is going to allow us to do is now go to Simulation, and then Hair Tools, Move, and if we move just this one guide, it's going to have some fall off applied to it in space. You'll see that the guide tips over here kind of have a lighter purplish color, and so they're going to be influenced less by the soft selection. The next thing that we have here is Dynamics Interaction, and we're actually going to skip over that and go to the Soft Selection Manager and the Symmetry Manager, as these two managers here are going to relate to the Symmetry option and the Soft Selection option. So let's turn Soft Selection off and the Symmetry on, and we'll open up the Symmetry Manager. With the Symmetry Manager open, you'll see that we now have a dialog here that has some options. And these options are really similar to any of the symmetry options we have seen in the Attributes Manager with some of the other tools. So we have a checkbox here to enable and disable symmetry, and you'll see that it also changes the toggle switch there. We have a search distance, which is going to allow for a little variation in where these guides are rooted. And depending on your search value here, that's how far you're allowed to have some variance between the roots. You then have options to change the coordinate systems. If you set this to custom, it is going to use a custom object that you set. And finally, for the mirror, you can choose your mirror planes. Now, since we have covered all of these options before, we are not going to go in depth on exactly what they do this time. Let's go ahead and close the Symmetry Manager, and we'll turn Symmetry off and turn Soft Selection back on, and open the Soft Selection Manager. And let's just move this over to the side here. So we're just going to go to a place where we can see some of the hair tips here. And then we're going to choose Live Selection. And as soon as we do this, we can see the fall off preview. Now in the Soft Selection Manager, you can click the Soft Selection checkbox to turn the soft selection off or on when it's checked. You can turn the preview on or off as well. So even if the preview isn't there, and we go to something like the Move tool, soft selection is still enabled. So if we move this around, you'll see that it's affecting more than just the selected guide. So the preview only affects those colors there. Next, we have a tweak mode here. And so I'm just going to make a selection on this one guide. And what the tweak mode will allow us to do is go to the tools and then choose something like straighten. And we can now use the straighten command with this. So let's just go root, and if we straighten now, you'll see that it is using a little bit of fall off on there for straightening all the guides around that one. And if we go normal, this is going to be a little bit more apparent. So I'll just undo a couple steps there again. We'll turn tweak mode off, and then we have a type. And so this is going to be how it determines where the fall off is going to be located. The first option here is volume. So if I select a point in space, it is going to select everything within a 3.937 inch radius. So that could be in the X direction, it could be in the Y direction, could even be in the Z direction. It's essentially just taking a giant sphere and selecting anything within that sphere. If we take a look at this, we can also see that there's an option for guide. And in this case, it's going to be giving us a fall off along the points or the segments on the guide itself. So if we go to simulation and then into hair mode and set this to points and select a point here, you'll see that fall off is now applied along the guide. And if we increase the value here, you'll see that those points will extend down along the guide. The next option is roots. What roots is going to do is simply look at the root of any selected guide, and then it's going to look out a certain distance from this guide. Anything that is within this area is going to be given the same selection weight along the entire guide. So you'll see that as we kind of move out in the distance here, these entire guides are the same value of purple. They're not getting any different fall off along the guide itself. So it simply looks at the route, extends outward, and selects the entire guide based on the proximity to the roots. Next, we have some options here for coordinates. You have screen coordinates and world coordinates. World coordinates are going to use an actual unit size, whereas the screen is just going to use a pixel distance. Really, use whatever one is going to work for you when you're styling hair. Next, you have a radius, and this is going to be used to set the distance of the fall off. So if we have a small radius, you'll see that it's a smaller fall off area, and increasing the radius is going to increase the fall off area. Strength allows you to blend from 0% to 100% of your given fall off. Clip is set there to make sure that no guides are receiving more than 100% weight. And this is just kind of in there as a catch-all for mistakes that might happen when you are working with all these fall-offs close together. Then you can control the shape of the fall-off. So we have no fall-off. There's linear, which is just going from 0 to 100% in a linear fashion, so each step is going to be divided as a smaller increment. And then there's different types like dome, which is going to have a longer top and then fall off quickly towards the edge, and so on. There's also spline, which is going to allow you to set your own custom fall off, and you just use the spline graph right here. Okay, so we're just going to turn that off, and we'll turn off soft selections as well. The final manager that we're going to look at here is the dynamics interaction. And we'll just move that off to the side and change the sizing of the window a little bit there. So the dynamic interaction manager here is an interesting little tool. And let's start just by hiding these out of the way. So when we're viewing hair in the viewport, it is a static object. And once we hit play, we can see that there is some simulation applied to this. So we'll just pause that again and go back to the start. With dynamic interaction, we can actually tell Cinema to redraw the scene, and that's going to produce dynamic results for us without us actually having to play the scene. Let's just turn this off again. And so you'll see that if we were using this to actually style the hair, we could take this state right here, go to Simulation, and then to Hair Edit, and you can choose the Set as Dynamics option, which would set this as the base state for the hair. Since it's not, we can actually just kind of flip through the timeline there to reset this to the default state. Now, we can also choose Redraw, and then uncheck that, and there's also a Reset button here, which will reset that to the default state. Now, we also have a Time option, so if we increase the Time option here, that's going to increase the amount of time between each step in this simulation. So if we go for something quite large, you can see that this gives you a good chance to pause this at any time if it comes to a position that you want. We can also set it to something relatively low to get something that's closer to a real-time feedback. Now with each one of these checkboxes, you have an option of saying what sort of effect is going to be updated in this dynamic interaction. For example, let's turn off Redraw, click Reset, and then we'll turn off Gravity, and click Redraw again. Now, because the hairs aren't actually being affected by gravity, they don't fall. If we check gravity, you'll see that that comes into play right away. And of course, if we uncheck again, you'll see that the hairs seem to kind of float up. There's also an option for stiffness, so we can reset, maybe turn gravity on there, and you'll see that the hairs are really loose. And turning stiffness back on adds some rigidity to those. Forces is going to be things like wind or anything like that that you might have in your scene. Collisions are going to be collisions with a collider object. And dynamics is going to be if there's a simulation at all. Now, you'll see that when dynamics is checked off, gravity, stiffness, and forces are grayed out. And that's really because none of those need to be calculated. Collisions is still available, though. So why is that? Let's start by resetting to the default pose, and then we're going to create a sphere. Let's just change the size of the sphere and move it over to the side here. I'm then going to convert the sphere and choose a hair tag and a hair collider. So right now, redraw is still on, so if we move the sphere, you'll see that it moves around just fine. Now, I do have the option of checking collisions. So this time when I move the sphere, whenever it collides with a guide, it's going to change that guide's position. So now you can almost use a 3D object as a form of styling your guides. Again, turning dynamics back on just enables the simulation completely again.